Tonight we descend into the gilded cages of ancient China's imperial palaces, where beauty was a curse and desire meant death. We're exploring the forgotten world of male concubines, men who lived in luxury but died in shadows, pampered yet powerless, desired yet disposable. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're 15 years old, blessed with features so delicate they could make emperors weep. Your family sells you not into slavery, but into what they call privilege. You're bathed in rose water, dressed in silk, and told you're destined for greatness. But as those palace gates close behind you, you realize the terrible truth. You haven't been chosen for greatness. You've been chosen for something far more dangerous. In the imperial courts of ancient China, male concubines weren't just servants or entertainers. They were living artwork, human treasures locked away in chambers where sunlight never reached and freedom was just a memory. Let me be clear about something right away. When we talk about male concubines in ancient China, we're not discussing some romantic fairy tale. We're talking about a system so brutal, so dehumanizing, that it turned young men into ornamental objects, valued not for their minds or their hearts, but for their ability to please, to perform, and ultimately to disappear without a trace when their beauty faded. The Han Dynasty, the Tang Dynasty, the Ming Dynasty, they all had one thing in common. They perfected the art of turning human beings into living dolls. And the male concubines, they were perhaps the most tragic victims of this system. Because while female concubines at least had the possibility of bearing children, of gaining some measure of protection through motherhood, male concubines had nothing. They were purely decorative, purely disposable. But here's what's truly disturbing. The selection process began when boys were barely old enough to understand what was happening to them. Talent scouts, if you can call them that, would roam the countryside looking for children with certain features. Smooth skin, delicate bone structure, eyes that sparkled with innocence. These weren't men choosing a profession. These were children being harvested. The families, desperate and poor, saw it as salvation. A son chosen for the imperial court meant money, status, maybe even protection for the entire household. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't have understood, was that they were essentially selling their children into a beautiful prison where the bars were made of silk and the locks were forged from imperial desire. Once selected, these boys underwent a transformation that was both physical and psychological. They were taken to special training houses, places that existed in the shadows of the great cities, where they learned to walk differently, speak differently, even breathe differently. Everything about them had to become perfect, polished, designed to catch and hold the attention of men who held the power of life and death in their hands. The training wasn't just about appearance. These young men had to master poetry, music, dance, conversation. They became living encyclopedias of culture and refinement. But all of this knowledge, all of this skill, it served one purpose: to make them more appealing to their future masters. They weren't being educated to think for themselves. They were being programmed to be the perfect complement to someone else's desires. And the competition among them was vicious. Because in the imperial court, there were always more concubines than there were positions of favor. So these young men, barely out of childhood, learned to see each other not as friends or allies, but as threats. They learned to smile while plotting, to embrace while calculating, to love while preparing for betrayal. The physical transformation was perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of their preparation. Many underwent procedures to maintain their youthful appearance, treatments that were painful and often dangerous. Some were given substances to prevent the development of facial hair, to keep their voices high and clear. Others endured more extreme measures, alterations that ensured they would never fully mature into manhood. But the psychological transformation was even more complete. These young men learned to suppress their own desires, their own dreams, their own identities. They became masters of performance, able to be whatever their patron wanted them to be at any given moment. Happy when happiness was required, melancholy when melancholy was fashionable, passionate when passion was demanded, cold when coldness was preferred. The irony was devastating. In a culture that valued male strength, male authority, male independence, these concubines were trained to embody the opposite of everything their society claimed to admire. They were taught to be weak, submissive, dependent. They were living contradictions, men who had been systematically unmanned. And when their training was complete, when they had been molded into the perfect ornamental humans, they entered the imperial court. But this wasn't graduation. This was the beginning of their real imprisonment. Because once you entered those walls as a male concubine, you belonged to the emperor, body and soul. Your life was no longer your own. Your future was no longer in your hands. The daily routine of a male concubine was a carefully orchestrated performance that began before dawn and ended long after midnight. They rose in darkness, not to the gentle stirring of natural awakening, but to the harsh commands of eunuch supervisors who controlled every moment of their existence. These supervisors, themselves victims of the imperial system, had learned that survival meant becoming the oppressor, and they ruled the concubines with an iron fist wrapped in silk gloves. The moaning began with ablutions that took hours. Every inch of their bodies had to be perfect, cleansed, perfumed, prepared for potential imperial inspection. They bathed in water infused with jasmine and chrysanthemum, their skin rubbed with oils that cost more than most families saw in a lifetime. But this wasn't luxury. This was livestock preparation. They were being made ready for consumption. Their clothing was chosen not by them, but for them. Colors that complemented their complexion, fabrics that enhanced their figure, accessories that caught the light in just the right way. They were dressed like living jewelry, each element carefully selected to create maximum visual impact. But beneath the silk and gold, they were still prisoners, still property, still utterly powerless. The hierarchy among male concubines was complex and brutal. At the top were the favorites, those who had somehow caught and held the emperor's attention long enough to gain a measure of protection. These men lived in relative comfort, with better quarters, finer food, more freedom of movement within their gilded cage. But their position was precarious, dependent entirely on the whims of a man who held absolute power and was known for his unpredictable moods. Below the favorites were the hopefuls, young men recently arrived at court, still believing that beauty and talent might elevate them above their circumstances. They competed desperately for any scrap of imperial attention, willing to betray friends, sacrifice principles, abandon dignity for the chance at favor. Their desperation was palpable, their hope both touching and tragic. At the bottom were the forgotten ones, concubines who had aged out of favor, whose beauty had faded or whose personalities had somehow displeased. These men existed in a strange limbo, too valuable to discard, but no longer desirable enough to maintain. They served as servants to the younger concubines, as cautionary tales, as living reminders of what awaited everyone in this system eventually. The emperor himself was the center of this bizarre universe, a man whose every word was law, whose every glance could elevate or destroy. But he wasn't necessarily the monster you might expect. Often, he was simply a product of his own system, raised to see other human beings as objects for his pleasure, taught that his desires were more important than anyone else's humanity. He had been shaped by absolute power, just as surely as the concubines had been shaped by absolute powerlessness. The relationships that formed in this environment were twisted parodies of human connection. Love, when it existed at all, was desperate and possessive. Friendship was strategic and temporary. Trust was a luxury no one could afford. The concubines learned to read micro-expressions, to detect shifts in mood, to anticipate needs before they were spoken. They became human mood rings, constantly adapting their colors to match their environment. And yet, despite everything, despite the dehumanization and the desperation, genuine emotions sometimes bloomed in this poisoned garden. Men fell in love with each other, with their captors, with impossible dreams of freedom. These emotions were dangerous, forbidden, but they persisted because the human heart refuses to be completely controlled, even in the most oppressive circumstances. The daily entertainment was perhaps the cruelest aspect of their existence. They were expected to be constantly amusing, constantly beautiful, constantly available. They performed poetry readings where every word was scrutinized for hidden meanings. They danced intricate choreographies where every movement was judged for grace and sensuality. They played musical instruments with fingers that trembled not from passion, but from fear. Between performances, they waited. And waiting was perhaps the most difficult part of their existence. Sitting in silk robes in perfumed chambers, they had nothing to do but think about their situation, to remember their families, to wonder about the lives they might have lived if they had been born less beautiful or into different circumstances. The waiting was where madness crept in, where despair took root, where hope slowly withered and died. The food they ate was exquisite, prepared by the finest chefs in the empire. Delicate soups, tender meats, exotic fruits, rare delicacies that most people would never taste in their lifetimes. But every meal was supervised, every bite monitored. They couldn't eat too much and risk losing their slender figures. They couldn't eat too little and risk appearing ungrateful. Even their hunger was regulated, controlled, managed by others. Their health was monitored constantly by imperial physicians who treated them like prize racehorses. Any sign of illness brought immediate attention, not out of compassion, but out of economic necessity. A sick concubine was a useless concubine, and useless things had a way of disappearing from the imperial court. So they learned to hide pain, to mask symptoms, to appear healthy and vibrant, even when they were dying inside. The education continued throughout their time in the palace. They were taught new skills, new arts, new ways to please and entertain. But this education was different from what they had received as children. Now it was purely practical, focused entirely on their function as objects of pleasure. They learned to read not for knowledge, but for performance. They studied music not for personal expression, but for imperial entertainment. And through it all, they aged. Day by day, year by year, their beauty faded and their value decreased. They watched younger men arrive at court, saw the emperor's attention shift to fresher faces, felt themselves sliding down the hierarchy toward obscurity and eventual disposal. The lucky ones might be given minor administrative positions, allowed to serve the palace in some capacity until they died of old age. The unlucky ones simply vanished, their fate unrecorded and unmourned. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of their existence was the way it corrupted their understanding of love, of relationships, of human worth. They learned that beauty was currency, that emotion was performance, that survival depended on making yourself indispensable to someone who saw you as dispensable. These lessons, carved into their souls by years of experience, made it nearly impossible for them to form genuine connections, even with each other. The few who managed to maintain some sense of their original identity, some connection to the person they had been before the palace, often suffered the most. They remembered freedom and mourned its loss. They remembered choice and ached for its return. They remembered dignity and grieved its absence. For them, the silk sheets felt like shrouds, the perfumed chambers like tombs, the golden chains like the bars of a beautiful prison. And then there were the rituals. Oh, the rituals! Because in the imperial court, even intimacy was ceremony, choreographed down to the smallest gesture. A male concubine didn't simply spend time with the emperor. He was summoned through an elaborate protocol that began hours before the actual encounter. First came the preparation ritual. Eunuch attendants would arrive at his quarters with oils that had been blessed by court astrologers, chosen for their supposed ability to enhance desire and ensure satisfaction. The concubine would be bathed again, even if he had already bathed that morning, because this wasn't about cleanliness. This was about transformation, about becoming something other than human. His hair would be arranged in styles that took hours to perfect, each strand positioned to catch candlelight in the most flattering way. Makeup would be applied, subtle but transformative, designed to enhance his natural beauty while making him appear almost otherworldly. And then came the clothing selection, a process that could take longer than the actual encounter it was preparing for. The walk to the emperor's chambers was its own performance. The concubine couldn't simply stroll through the palace corridors. He had to move with a specific grace, a trained sensuality that suggested eagerness without appearing desperate, availability without seeming common. Every step was calculated, every gesture rehearsed, every expression carefully managed. But here's what made it truly horrifying. The emperor might change his mind. Halfway through this elaborate preparation, word might come that His Imperial Majesty had decided on someone else, or had chosen to spend the evening alone, or had been distracted by some matter of state. And the concubine, after hours of preparation, after building himself up mentally and emotionally for this encounter, would be dismissed, sent back to his chambers to wait for the next summons, which might come tomorrow or might never come again. When the encounter did happen, it was theater. The concubine had to be whatever the emperor wanted him to be in that moment. Passionate lover, innocent youth, sophisticated companion, whatever role the imperial mood demanded. And he had to read those moods instantly, adjust his performance without missing a beat, because a misstep could mean exile or death. The emperor held absolute power over life and death, but he was also trapped in his own way. He had been raised to believe that his desires were the center of the universe, that other people existed solely for his pleasure. But this meant he had never learned to form genuine relationships, never experienced real intimacy, never knew if someone cared for him or simply feared him. So he, too, was isolated, surrounded by performers, but never truly known by anyone. After these encounters, the concubine would return to his quarters and begin the psychological reconstruction. He had to process what had happened, file it away in his memory, prepare himself to repeat the performance when called upon again. Some learned to dissociate, to separate their minds from their bodies during these sessions. Others threw themselves completely into the role, losing themselves so thoroughly in the performance that they forgot who they had been before. The competition among concubines reached its most vicious during these selection processes. They would sabotage each other in subtle ways, spread rumors, plant seeds of doubt about their rivals' loyalty or enthusiasm. Some would go to extraordinary lengths to ensure they were chosen, volunteering for humiliating tasks, betraying confidences, sacrificing their last shreds of dignity for a chance at imperial favor. And the strangest part? Some of them began to genuinely believe they were privileged. After years in the system, after having their minds slowly warped by the constant reinforcement that they were special, chosen, elevated above common people, some concubines actually felt grateful for their captivity. They had been so thoroughly broken and rebuilt that they couldn't imagine any other existence. The few who tried to escape faced consequences that made death seem merciful. Captured runaways weren't simply executed. They were made examples of, punished in ways designed to terrify the other concubines into compliance. Some were forced to watch as their fingers were broken, one by one, while court officials explained that hands that had touched the emperor's body without permission would never touch anything again. Others were subjected to psychological torture, forced to kneel in public squares while their crimes were read aloud, their families' names dragged through the mud, their former beauty systematically destroyed through calculated disfigurement. The message was clear. You belong to us completely, and any attempt to reclaim your life will result in suffering beyond imagination. But perhaps most cruel of all were the concubines who were granted fake freedom. Sometimes, when an emperor grew tired of a particular favorite, instead of having him killed or exiled, he would be given a small house outside the palace walls and told he was free to live as he chose. But freedom was an illusion. These men had been so thoroughly shaped by palace life that they couldn't function in the outside world. They had no practical skills, no understanding of how to earn money or form relationships with people who weren't part of the imperial system. Many of these supposedly freed concubines would end up begging to return to the palace, preferring their beautiful prison to the terrifying uncertainty of actual freedom. And sometimes, if the emperor was feeling particularly cruel or nostalgic, he would allow them back, but in diminished roles, as servants to the younger concubines, forced to watch their replacements living the life they had once known. The seasonal changes brought their own forms of torment. Spring meant new arrivals, fresh-faced boys who made the established concubines feel ancient by comparison. Summer brought extended outdoor entertainments where they had to maintain their composure and beauty in sweltering heat while performing for hours. Autumn was a time of anxiety, as emperors often used the changing seasons as an excuse to refresh their collection of favorites. And winter brought the greatest fear of all, because the long dark months gave emperors time to brood, to find fault, to decide that changes were needed in their personal retinue. The concubines developed their own secret language, subtle gestures and coded phrases that allowed them to communicate without alerting their supervisors. They shared information about the emperor's moods, warned each other about dangerous eunuch officials, offered comfort in the only ways they could manage. But even these small acts of solidarity were risky, because friendship could be seen as conspiracy, and conspiracy was treason. Some tried to find escape through madness, allowing their minds to break rather than continue enduring their circumstances. But even madness wasn't a refuge, because mad concubines were considered defective goods, and defective goods had no place in the imperial court. They would be quietly removed, their fate unrecorded, their existence erased from palace records, as if they had never been there at all. The truly heartbreaking cases were the concubines who tried to maintain hope, who continued to believe, year after year, that their situation might improve, that they might find a way back to freedom, that their families might somehow rescue them. These men aged with their dreams intact, their spirits gradually crushed not by sudden cruelty, but by the slow realization that hope itself was just another form of torture. And then there were the religious ones who turned to Buddhism or Taoism for comfort, trying to find meaning in their suffering, believing that their current life was either karmic punishment for past wrongs or a test they needed to pass to achieve enlightenment. They meditated in their silk-draped chambers, chanted sutras between performances, and tried to detach their consciousness from their physical circumstances. But even religion became complicated in the palace, because spiritual devotion could be seen as divided loyalty, and divided loyalty was dangerous. The most successful concubines, the ones who managed to survive and even thrive in this system, often became the most dangerous. They learned to manipulate the emperor's emotions, to play on his insecurities and desires, to make themselves indispensable, not just as objects of pleasure, but as confidants and advisors. These men wielded a strange form of power, influence without official position, authority without recognition. But that power came at a cost. The more influence a concubine gained, the more enemies he made among court officials who resented his access to the emperor. Palace eunuchs, in particular, saw successful concubines as threats to their own positions and would work tirelessly to undermine them. It became a deadly game of politics played with smiles and silk, where a misunderstood gesture could end a life. The record-keeping was meticulous and chilling. Palace scribes maintained detailed records of each concubine's performance, their physical condition, their emotional state, even their dreams when they could be discovered. These weren't personnel files. They were breeding records, livestock documentation for human beings. Every aspect of their existence was cataloged, measured, evaluated for efficiency and effectiveness. The documentation was organized by season, by mood, by imperial preference. Spring entries noted which concubines bloomed with the flowers, whose beauty complemented the awakening earth. Summer records tracked who could maintain their composure during the sweltering entertainments, who wilted under pressure. Autumn logs detailed the harvest of new arrivals and the culling of those who had lost their appeal. Winter documentation was the most brutal, chronicling the long months when emperors had time to scrutinize, to find flaws, to decide who would see another spring. But here's what those meticulous records never captured: the sound of quiet weeping in silk-draped chambers after midnight. The way a young man's hands would shake when he heard his name called for imperial service. The desperate prayers whispered to ancestors who could no longer hear them. The record keepers documented the performance, but they never recorded the cost. The clothing system alone was a masterclass in psychological control. Each concubine was assigned specific colors based on their status, their favor level, their seasonal appropriateness. Those in high favor wore deep purples and rich golds, colors that caught the emperor's eye and marked them as prizes worth noticing. The hopefuls wore lighter shades, pastels that suggested innocence and availability. The forgotten ones dressed in muted tones that helped them blend into the background, becoming human wallpaper in their own lives. But the cruelest touch was the seasonal wardrobe changes. Twice a year, all clothing would be redistributed based on current favor rankings. A concubine might wake up to find his purple robes replaced with pale yellow, a demotion announced through fabric. Others might discover gold thread where there had been silver, elevation without explanation. They learned to read their status, not in words, but in the weight of silk, the quality of embroidery, the number of layers they were permitted to wear. The hairstyles followed equally rigid protocols. Length indicated favor, style suggested availability, ornaments marked special occasions or imperial preferences. A concubine's hair was never truly his own. It was styled by others, maintained by others, altered at others' whims. Some men watched their hair being cut, knowing they were watching their value being diminished with each falling strand. Others had their hair elaborately dressed for special occasions, feeling the weight of expectation in every carefully placed pin. The makeup rituals were perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of their daily existence. Every morning, they sat still while artists transformed their faces, painting over their natural features to create something more appealing to imperial tastes. They watched themselves disappear under layers of powder and paint, their own identity erased and replaced with whatever aesthetic was currently fashionable. Some concubines began to forget what they looked like without makeup. They would catch glimpses of themselves in mirrors during private moments and not recognize the person staring back. The face in the reflection seemed like a stranger, someone they might have known long ago but could no longer place. This disconnection from their own appearance was intentional, designed to make them more pliable, more willing to become whatever was required of them. The seasonal festivals brought their own unique torments. During the spring festival, concubines were expected to embody renewal and hope, performing elaborate dances that celebrated new life while their own lives remained trapped in eternal stasis. The Mid-Autumn Festival required them to represent the harmony of family reunion while they were permanently separated from their own families. The Winter Solstice demanded that they symbolize the triumph of light over darkness while living in perpetual shadow. Each festival performance was a masterpiece of irony, requiring them to celebrate concepts they had been systematically denied. They sang songs about freedom while living in captivity, performed dances about love while being denied genuine affection, recited poetry about honor while their own dignity was stripped away daily. The audiences, drunk on wine and power, never noticed the bitter tragedy of these performances. The gift-giving customs were particularly twisted. Emperors would bestow presents on favored concubines, but these gifts always came with strings attached. A piece of jewelry might be beautiful, but it also served as a tracking device, its unique design making the wearer instantly identifiable throughout the palace. Clothing gifts often came with specific instructions about when and how they should be worn, turning acts of apparent generosity into additional forms of control. Books were the cruelest gifts of all. An emperor might present a concubine with a collection of poetry about freedom, travel narratives from distant lands, or philosophical treatises about self-determination. These books became instruments of torture, filling their minds with concepts they could never experience, dreams they could never pursue, ideas that only emphasized the contrast between what was possible and what was permitted. The concubines developed elaborate coping mechanisms to survive the psychological assault of their daily existence. Some created internal fantasy worlds where they were the protagonists of their own stories, heroes on grand adventures rather than prisoners in golden cages. Others practiced a form of emotional compartmentalization, separating their true selves from the personas they performed, keeping a small kernel of authentic identity hidden away where it couldn't be touched or corrupted. A few turned to scholarship, memorizing vast quantities of literature and philosophy, not because they were required to, but because knowledge became their only form of rebellion. They couldn't control their bodies, their time, or their circumstances, but they could fill their minds with ideas that belonged entirely to them. These secret scholars would share knowledge with trusted friends, creating underground networks of learning that existed entirely outside the official palace education system. The most heartbreaking coping mechanism was the creation of substitute families. Concubines would form deep bonds with each other, taking on roles of brothers, fathers, sons in relationships that provided some echo of the family connections they had lost. These chosen families offered comfort and support, but they were always fragile, always vulnerable to the political machinations that could separate or destroy them at any moment. The eunuch overseers understood these coping mechanisms and worked systematically to undermine them. Fantasy worlds were shattered through deliberate reality checks, forced confrontations with the harshness of their actual situation. Emotional compartmentalization was attacked through unpredictable demands that required authentic responses, making it impossible to maintain the separation between public and private selves. Secret scholarship was perhaps the most dangerous rebellion, because educated concubines were seen as potential threats to the established order. Those discovered with unauthorized knowledge faced punishments designed not just to hurt them, but to serve as warnings to others. Their books would be burned in front of the entire concubine population, their fingers damaged to prevent future writing, their access to any reading material permanently revoked. The substitute families were destroyed through strategic relocations, sudden promotions, or demotions that separated bonded groups, and the deliberate fostering of jealousy and competition. Overseers would show favoritism to one member of a close group, creating resentment and suspicion that would eventually tear the relationships apart. They understood that isolated concubines were more manageable than those with strong support networks. The medical examinations were another form of control disguised as care. Palace physicians conducted regular inspections of the concubines, ostensibly to maintain their health, but actually to monitor their physical and mental condition for any signs of rebellion or deterioration. These examinations were intimate, invasive, and deeply humiliating, designed to remind the concubines that every part of their bodies belonged to the state. The physicians kept detailed records of each man's physical development, tracking changes that might affect their desirability. Weight fluctuations, skin conditions, signs of aging, evidence of illness or injury, all were documented with clinical precision. But they also noted behavioral changes, emotional responses, signs of depression or anxiety that might indicate a concubine was becoming unreliable or potentially dangerous. Some concubines were subjected to experimental treatments designed to preserve their youth and beauty. These procedures were often painful and sometimes dangerous, but refusal was not an option. They were given substances to prevent body hair growth, treatments to maintain soft skin, procedures to alter their voices or physical features. The goal was to keep them as close as possible to the idealized image of eternal youth and beauty. The most invasive procedures were performed on those showing signs of aging or physical deterioration. Some underwent primitive forms of cosmetic surgery, operations performed without anesthesia by physicians who saw them as test subjects rather than patients. Others were given drugs that affected their mental state, substances that made them more compliant but also more vulnerable to psychological manipulation. The dietary control extended far beyond simple weight management. Concubines were fed specific foods believed to enhance their attractiveness or alter their temperament. Certain herbs were thought to improve skin quality, others to increase energy levels or enhance emotional responsiveness. Their meals were planned not for nutritional value, but for cosmetic and behavioral effects. Some were given foods that would make them more sexually appealing, while others received dietary restrictions designed to maintain their boyish figures well into adulthood. The kitchen staff who prepared these specialized meals were sworn to secrecy, understanding that knowledge of the concubine's dietary manipulation could be dangerous if it fell into the wrong hands. The sleeping arrangements were carefully orchestrated to maximize control and minimize resistance. Concubines were housed in specific configurations, designed to prevent the formation of strong alliances while encouraging competition and surveillance. Roommates were chosen not for compatibility, but for their likelihood to report on each other's behavior. The bedrooms themselves were designed to be comfortable enough to prevent desperation, but not so luxurious as to create contentment. Every surface was soft, every color was soothing, but there were no sharp objects, no heavy items that could be used as weapons, no means of barricading doors or windows. They were padded cells disguised as luxury accommodations. Sleep schedules were regulated to ensure that concubines were always slightly tired, never fully rested enough to plan effectively or think clearly about their situation. They were kept in a perpetual state of mild exhaustion that made them more compliant and less likely to organize any form of resistance. The few concubines who managed to maintain their mental clarity despite all these controls often became the most valuable to the emperor, but also the most dangerous to themselves. Their intelligence made them better companions, more interesting conversationalists, more skilled at providing the intellectual stimulation that many emperors craved. But that same intelligence also made them more aware of their degradation, more capable of recognizing the full scope of their imprisonment. These clear-headed men walked a razor's edge between value and danger. They had to be intelligent enough to entertain, but not so perceptive as to become threatening. They had to show wisdom without demonstrating independence, display knowledge without suggesting they might use it for their own purposes. One wrong word, One too clever observation, one hint that they saw through the system that held them, and they could find themselves facing consequences that would make them long for the simplicity of ignorance. The palace walls held secrets that went far deeper than anyone outside could imagine. Hidden passages connected the concubine quarters to observation rooms, where overseers could watch and listen without being detected. Every private moment was potentially public, every whispered conversation possibly overheard, every gesture monitored and analyzed for signs of discontent or rebellion. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire system was how efficiently it reproduced itself. Some of the eunuch overseers had once been concubines themselves, men who had survived by learning to identify completely with their captors, internalizing the system so completely that they became its most effective enforcers. They understood every trick, every hiding place, every form of resistance, because they had once attempted all of them themselves. These former concubines turned overseers were often the cruelest, because they had to constantly prove their loyalty to a system that had once oppressed them. They showed no mercy to the young men under their control, understanding that any sign of sympathy or compassion would be seen as weakness, potentially resulting in their own downfall and return to powerless status. The cycle continued, generation after generation, with each group of concubines producing a few survivors who would eventually become the overseers of the next group. It was a system designed to perpetuate itself, to ensure that there would always be someone who understood exactly how to break down resistance, how to identify potential troublemakers, how to maintain control over men who had every reason to rebel. And so the beautiful prison continued to function, its golden bars polished by the tears of those trapped within, its silk chains strengthened by the despair of men who had learned that survival sometimes required becoming everything they had once despised. The male concubines of ancient China lived and died in luxury, surrounded by beauty and comfort, but never, ever free. The worst part wasn't the physical preparation, or even the constant surveillance. It was the letters. Every month, without fail, each concubine was required to write a letter home to his family. A cheerful, grateful letter describing his wonderful life in the palace. How honored he felt to serve the emperor, how well he was being treated, how much he had learned and grown. These letters were dictated word for word by palace officials, but the concubines had to write them in their own handwriting. They had to sign their own names to lies about their happiness. Their families, desperate to believe their sacrifice had been worthwhile, treasured these letters as proof that their sons were thriving. Meanwhile, the young men who wrote them often had to pause between sentences to wipe away tears that would smudge the ink. The families would sometimes write back, sharing news from home, asking for advice, expressing pride in their son's elevated status. These return letters were the cruelest torture of all. Reading about harvest festivals they would never attend, marriages they would never celebrate, births of children they would never hold. The outside world continued without them, but they were frozen in time, trapped in amber made of silk and gold. Some concubines begged to stop receiving these letters from home, but that wasn't allowed either. The palace officials understood that cutting all ties to their former lives would remove one more layer of psychological control. Hope was more useful than despair, because hope could be manipulated. A man with nothing left to lose was dangerous. A man still clinging to the possibility of seeing his family again would endure almost anything. The seasonal gift exchanges with their families were particularly twisted. Twice a year, concubines were allowed to send presents home, but only items that had been pre-approved by palace censors. Usually small, expensive trinkets that would impress the family with their son's apparent prosperity, while revealing nothing about his actual circumstances. Gold pins, silk scarves, jade ornaments, all purchased with money the concubines had never earned. bought with currency that belonged to their captors. In return, families would send humble gifts from home: hand-woven cloth, dried fruits, pressed flowers, small carvings made by younger siblings. These simple offerings were infinitely more precious to the concubines than any imperial treasure, but they came with their own form of agony. Every gift was a reminder of a world they could no longer inhabit, relationships they could no longer maintain, a life that continued to exist but was forever beyond their reach. The most heartbreaking gifts were the ones from children. Younger brothers and sisters who drew pictures of their family with their concubine sibling still included, still at home, still part of their daily lives. These innocent drawings showed a reality that no longer existed, a fantasy of wholeness that made the separation even more painful. But here's what made it truly insidious. The palace officials would sometimes hint that good behavior might eventually lead to visits home, or even permanent return to family life. These hints were always vague, always conditional, always just out of reach. Like a carrot dangled before a starving horse, the possibility of freedom was used to ensure compliance and crush any thoughts of rebellion. The truth was that no male concubine had ever been returned to his family. Once you entered the palace, you belonged to it forever. But the officials were careful never to state this explicitly, because hope was such an effective form of control. Better to let the concubines believe that freedom might be possible than to face the desperation of men who knew they had nothing left to lose. The education system within the palace was designed to erase their former identities completely. They were taught new names, new histories, new personalities that fit their roles as imperial playthings. Their original names were forbidden, their family histories rewritten or simply ignored. They learned to introduce themselves with titles that described their function rather than their identity. Some concubines forgot their birth names entirely after years of disuse. When asked in private moments who they had been before the palace, they would pause, confused, reaching for memories that had been systematically overwritten. The boy who had played in rice fields, who had helped his father with farming, who had dreamed of marriage and children, that person became as distant and unreal as a character from a story someone had once told them. The language lessons were particularly insidious. They were taught to speak in specific ways that marked them as palace property. Their vocabulary was limited to words appropriate for their station, their grammar modified to always place themselves in subservient positions. They learned to refer to their own bodies as if they were discussing objects that belonged to someone else. The poetry they memorized was carefully selected to reinforce their powerlessness. Verses about the beauty of sacrifice, the honor of service, the wisdom of accepting one's fate. They recited these poems so often that the words became embedded in their thinking, shaping their internal dialogue in ways they didn't even recognize. But the most sophisticated form of psychological control was the way the system turned their own emotions against them. When a concubine felt grateful for a moment of kindness, he was taught to see this gratitude as proof that the system was benevolent. When he felt affection for another concubine, he was shown how that affection made him vulnerable and dependent. When he experienced brief moments of happiness, he was reminded that this happiness existed only because of imperial generosity. They learned to distrust their own feelings, to question their own perceptions, to doubt their own memories of life before the palace. The officials were skilled at gaslighting, convincing the concubines that their unhappiness was a character flaw, their desire for freedom was ingratitude, their longing for home was childish weakness. The religious instruction they received was equally manipulative. They were taught that their current situation was the result of karma from past lives, that suffering was necessary for spiritual growth, that resistance to their fate would only create more bad karma for future incarnations. The very beliefs that might have given them comfort were twisted into chains that bound them more securely to their captivity. Some concubines found solace in secret meditation practices, but even these were monitored and controlled. The eunuch overseers were trained to recognize the signs of deep meditation and would interrupt any practice that seemed to be providing too much inner peace or mental clarity. They understood that a concubine who achieved genuine spiritual detachment might become immune to their psychological manipulations. The festivals and celebrations throughout the year became exercises in elaborate pretense. During the New Year celebrations, concubines were required to participate in ceremonies of renewal and hope, while their own lives remained trapped in endless repetition. They lit incense for ancestors they could no longer honor, made wishes they knew would never come true, celebrated new beginnings while trapped in perpetual stasis. The Dragon Boat Festival required them to commemorate loyalty and sacrifice, concepts that had been perverted in their own lives into tools of oppression. They ate traditional foods that reminded them of home while sitting in chambers that would never be home. They participated in competitions and games that mimicked freedom while being watched by guards who ensured they never forgot their captivity. The Ghost Festival was perhaps the most psychologically damaging of all the celebrations. This was when families honored deceased relatives, when the living connected with the dead, when the bonds between generations were celebrated and reinforced. For the concubines, it was a reminder that they were the living dead, cut off from both their ancestors and their descendants, existing in a liminal space between life and death. They were required to perform ceremonies honoring the emperor's ancestors while being forbidden to honor their own. They lit candles for imperial ghosts while their own family spirits remained unremembered. They participated in rituals designed to ensure the continuation of bloodlines while being systematically prevented from creating bloodlines of their own. The winter months brought the deepest psychological challenges. The shorter days and longer nights provided more time for reflection, more opportunities for depression and despair to take root. The cold weather meant more time spent indoors, in close proximity to other concubines who were struggling with their own demons. Palace officials recognized that winter was the most dangerous season for maintaining control over the concubines. The combination of seasonal depression, enforced proximity, and reduced activities created conditions ripe for conspiracy and rebellion. So they implemented special winter protocols designed to keep the concubines isolated and distracted. The heating system in the concubine quarters was deliberately inadequate, not enough to cause serious harm, but insufficient for comfort. This constant mild discomfort served multiple purposes. It kept the concubines focused on immediate physical needs, rather than larger questions about their situation. It made them grateful for small comforts that were granted as rewards for good behavior. And it reminded them constantly of their dependence on imperial generosity for even basic needs. The winter entertainment programs were increased dramatically, with multiple performances required each day. But these weren't designed to provide genuine enjoyment or creative outlet. They were calculated to exhaust the concubines mentally and physically, leaving them too tired to think clearly about their circumstances or plan any form of resistance. The most insidious winter tradition was the annual evaluation process. Each concubine underwent a comprehensive review of their performance over the past year, with detailed assessments of their physical condition, emotional stability, skill development, and overall value to the imperial household. These evaluations determined their status for the coming year, their living conditions, their access to privileges, and ultimately their survival. The evaluation process was designed to pit concubines against each other, encouraging them to highlight their rivals' weaknesses while emphasizing their own strengths. Friendships were destroyed, alliances were shattered, and trust was systematically eroded as each man fought for his position in the hierarchy. Those who received poor evaluations faced consequences that ranged from reduced privileges to complete exile from the palace. But exile wasn't freedom. It was often a death sentence, as former concubines had no skills for surviving in the outside world and no family willing to accept their return. They became beggars, outcasts, or worse, dying alone and unmourned in the streets of cities that had once celebrated their beauty. The evaluation process also included medical examinations that were far more invasive and humiliating than the regular health checks. Every aspect of their physical condition was scrutinized, measured, and compared to imperial standards of attractiveness. Those showing signs of aging or physical deterioration were marked for demotion or disposal. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of the winter evaluations was the way they forced concubines to participate in their own dehumanization. They were required to write self-assessments, detailing their own strengths and weaknesses, their goals for improvement, their gratitude for imperial generosity. They had to reduce themselves to lists of attributes and skills, to evaluate their own worth in terms of their usefulness as objects of pleasure. The psychological pressure of these evaluations led some concubines to extreme measures. Some would injure themselves to gain sympathy. Others would make desperate attempts to enhance their appearance through dangerous procedures. A few would try to sabotage their rivals through poison or other means, risking execution for the slim chance of improving their own standing. The aftermath of the evaluations was equally traumatic. Those who received good reviews experienced a mixture of relief and guilt, knowing that their success often came at the expense of others who would face punishment or exile. Those who received poor reviews faced a year of reduced status, knowing that they were marked for eventual disposal, unless they could somehow improve their standing. The spring renewal ceremonies that followed the winter evaluations were designed to give the concubines hope while simultaneously reinforcing their powerlessness. Those who had survived another year were encouraged to see it as a gift from the emperor, a sign of his benevolence and their own worthiness. They were required to participate in Thanksgiving rituals, expressing gratitude for the opportunity to continue serving. But the spring ceremonies also brought new arrivals, fresh-faced boys who reminded the established concubines of their own diminishing value. The cycle began again, with new competitions, new hierarchies, new opportunities for betrayal and disappointment. The established concubines were expected to help train the newcomers, to pass on the skills and knowledge they had acquired. But this mentoring role was complicated by the knowledge that each new arrival was a potential replacement, someone younger and more appealing who might take their place in the emperor's favor. Some older concubines became bitter and cruel in their training methods, taking out their own frustrations on the vulnerable newcomers. Others tried to maintain some humanity, offering genuine guidance and support, even knowing it might hasten their own obsolescence. But all of them understood that time was their enemy, that each passing season brought them closer to irrelevance and disposal. The most successful concubines were those who learned to reinvent themselves repeatedly, finding new ways to remain valuable as their physical beauty faded. Some became administrators, managing the complex logistics of palace life. Others became teachers, passing on skills and knowledge to newer arrivals. A few became confidants and advisors, using their accumulated wisdom about palace politics to maintain their relevance. But even the most successful adaptations were temporary. The system was designed to consume and discard, to constantly refresh itself with new beauty and new innocence. No matter how clever, how adaptable, how valuable a concubine became, he was ultimately expendable, replaceable, and destined for eventual disposal. The palace records from this period, when they can be found and deciphered, tell a story of systematic cruelty disguised as refinement. They document the lives and deaths of thousands of young men who were reduced to catalog entries, their humanity stripped away and replaced with assessments of their physical attributes and performance capabilities. But between the lines of those clinical records, if you know how to read them, you can find traces of the real human cost of this system. The sudden disappearances, the unexplained illnesses, the mysterious accidents that befell those who showed signs of resistance or independence. The pattern of deaths that clustered around evaluation periods, seasonal changes, and imperial transitions. The few concubines who managed to leave any personal records behind painted a picture of psychological torment that went far beyond physical abuse. They described the constant fear, the crushing loneliness, the gradual erosion of their sense of self. They wrote about watching friends disappear, about participating in their own degradation, about the strange way that luxury could become its own form of torture when it was imposed rather than chosen. These personal accounts, hidden in private letters or coded into apparently innocuous poetry, reveal the human reality behind the golden facade. They show us men who struggled to maintain their dignity, their sanity, and their humanity in a system designed to strip all three away. They remind us that behind every historical atrocity, no matter how distant or exotic it may seem, were real people who suffered, who hoped, who tried to find meaning in circumstances that seemed designed to make meaning impossible. The male concubines of ancient China were trapped in a beautiful nightmare that lasted for centuries, a system so perfectly designed to break human spirits that it continued to function generation after generation, consuming young lives and producing nothing but the temporary pleasure of men who had unlimited power and no understanding of its true cost. The tea ceremonies were the worst part, not because of what happened during them, but because of what they represented. Every afternoon at precisely 3 o'clock, the concubines would be summoned to participate in elaborate tea rituals that had nothing to do with refreshment and everything to do with performance. Picture this. 20 young men arranged in perfect formation around low tables, their movements choreographed to the second. The way they held the cups, the angle of their wrists, the timing of their sips, all of it had been rehearsed thousands of times until it became automatic. But here's the thing that made it truly horrifying. The tea was always cold. The servants would brew it fresh, but by the time it reached the concubine's lips, it had been sitting long enough to lose all warmth. This wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. Because warm tea might have provided actual comfort, and comfort wasn't the point. The point was to demonstrate that even the most basic human pleasure could be controlled, regulated, and ultimately denied. The emperor would watch these ceremonies from a raised platform, studying each movement, each expression, each tiny gesture for signs of imperfection. A trembling hand might indicate fear. A slight smile might suggest hidden thoughts. Even the way a concubine swallowed could be interpreted as a message about his state of mind. And the conversations during these tea ceremonies, they were scripts, basically. Each concubine had memorized dozens of appropriate responses to potential imperial comments. If the emperor mentioned the weather, there were 3 acceptable ways to respond, each calibrated to show the perfect balance of intelligence and deference. If he asked about their health, the answer had to convey gratitude while avoiding any suggestion that palace life was anything less than perfect. But sometimes the emperor would go off script. He'd ask a question that hadn't been anticipated, make a comment that required genuine thinking rather than memorized responses. These moments were terrifying because they demanded authenticity from men who had been systematically trained to be inauthentic. The wrong spontaneous reaction could mark a concubine for punishment or worse. The younger concubines were the most vulnerable during these sessions because they hadn't yet learned to completely suppress their natural reactions. A look of confusion, a moment of hesitation, even a genuine laugh at the wrong time could be interpreted as disrespect or evidence of incomplete training. The older concubines would watch these mistakes with a mixture of sympathy and relief. understanding that every error by a newcomer made their own performance seem more polished by comparison. The seating arrangements during tea ceremonies followed complex protocols that changed monthly, sometimes weekly. Your position relative to the emperor indicated your current status in ways that everyone understood, but no one discussed openly. Sitting closer to the imperial platform meant favor. Being placed near the back suggested decline. Being absent entirely meant you were being evaluated for potential disposal. The most psychologically damaging aspect of these ceremonies was the way they normalized the abnormal. Sitting in elegant robes, sipping tea in beautiful surroundings, engaging in polite conversation, it all seemed so civilized on the surface. But underneath this veneer of refinement was a system of absolute control that monitored every breath, every blink, every involuntary muscle twitch. The concubines learned to dissociate during these sessions, to separate their consciousness from their bodies, so completely that they could perform perfectly while thinking about something else entirely. Some would mentally recite poetry from their childhood. Others would construct elaborate fantasy scenarios where they were free. A few would simply count, focusing on numbers to avoid focusing on their reality. But dissociation came with its own dangers. The eunuch overseers were trained to recognize the signs of mental absence, the subtle changes in facial expression or body language that indicated a concubine wasn't fully present. Being caught dissociating could result in additional training sessions designed to keep the mind firmly anchored in the present moment. The training for these additional sessions was particularly cruel because it involved sensory overload rather than deprivation. Concubines would be subjected to loud noises, bright lights, strong smells, anything that would make it impossible to retreat into their own minds. They would be forced to describe their immediate surroundings in minute detail, to prove that their attention was focused on the physical world rather than escaping into mental refuges. The tea ceremony equipment itself was chosen for psychological impact. The cups were so delicate that holding them required constant attention to avoid breaking them. The tables were positioned at angles that forced uncomfortable postures, creating physical tension that made mental relaxation nearly impossible. Even the lighting was calculated to create subtle eye strain that would increase overall discomfort without being obvious enough to complain about. The timing of these ceremonies was equally strategic. They were scheduled during the natural afternoon energy dip, when people normally feel sleepy or unfocused. But the concubines weren't allowed to show any signs of fatigue. They had to appear alert, engaged, and grateful for the opportunity to participate, even when their bodies were naturally inclined toward rest. The cleanup after each ceremony was almost as ritualized as the ceremony itself. Each concubine had to wash his own cup using specific motions, dry it with designated cloths, and place it in precisely the correct position for the next day's use. This wasn't about hygiene. It was about reinforcing the idea that even the most mundane tasks were subject to imperial control. But here's what made the tea ceremonies truly insidious. They were presented as privileges. The concubines were told they were honored to participate in these refined cultural activities, that they were receiving education in imperial etiquette that would elevate them above common people. The system convinced them to be grateful for their own psychological torture. Some concubines actually began to believe this narrative. After years of participating in these ceremonies, they would speak proudly of their cultural refinement, their sophisticated understanding of proper behavior, their elevation above the crude masses outside the palace walls. They had internalized their oppression so completely that they saw it as a form of superiority. The seasonal variations in the tea ceremonies added another layer of psychological complexity. Spring ceremonies emphasized renewal and growth, forcing concubines to embody hope and optimism regardless of their actual emotional state. Summer sessions focused on energy and vitality, requiring performances of enthusiasm even from those who were dying inside. Autumn ceremonies centered on gratitude and acceptance, demanding that concubines express thankfulness for their circumstances while suppressing any desire for change. Winter sessions emphasized endurance and patience, requiring displays of contentment with waiting, with stasis, with the eternal postponement of any real life. The poetry recitations that accompanied some tea ceremonies were particularly twisted. Concubines would be required to recite verses about freedom, about love, about the beauty of choice and self-determination. They had to speak these words with conviction, to embody concepts they had been systematically denied, to celebrate ideals that had been used to justify their captivity. The most accomplished concubines became skilled at layering meaning into these recitations, finding ways to express their true feelings through subtle changes in emphasis or delivery that only other concubines would recognize. It was a form of resistance so subtle that it was almost invisible, but it provided some small measure of psychological survival for those who mastered it. The musical accompaniment to tea ceremonies followed similar patterns of psychological manipulation. The melodies were designed to evoke specific emotional responses, to create artificial feelings of peace, contentment, or melancholy, depending on the emperor's mood or the season's requirements. The concubines learned to recognize these musical cues and adjust their behavior accordingly. But the most sophisticated form of control was the way the ceremonies created artificial intimacy. The quiet conversations, the shared cultural experiences, the appearance of voluntary participation, all of it was designed to make the concubines feel as though they were friends rather than prisoners, guests rather than captives, participants rather than victims. This false intimacy was perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of the entire system, because it prevented the concubines from clearly recognizing their oppression. When your captor treats you with apparent kindness, when your prison is beautiful and comfortable, when your suffering is disguised as privilege, it becomes much harder to maintain clarity about your situation. The few concubines who managed to see through this illusion of intimacy often suffered the most, because they understood the full scope of their manipulation. They recognized that every moment of apparent kindness was calculated, every gesture of apparent affection was strategic, every sign of apparent respect was designed to maintain control rather than express genuine regard. These clear-sighted individuals faced a terrible choice. They could try to warn others about the reality of their situation, risking punishment and potentially making life worse for everyone. Or they could remain silent, allowing their fellow concubines to maintain their illusions while bearing the burden of truth alone. Most chose silence, understanding that ignorance was sometimes a mercy, that the psychological defenses their companions had built were necessary for survival. But this silence came at a cost to their own sanity, creating an isolation within isolation that was almost unbearable. The annual tea ceremony competitions were the pinnacle of this systematic psychological abuse. Concubines would be judged not just on their technical performance, but on their ability to project genuine happiness and gratitude while participating in their own degradation. The winners received privileges that made them more complicit in the system, while the losers faced consequences that reinforced their powerlessness. These competitions created a perverse incentive structure where success meant becoming a more perfect victim, where excellence was measured by the complete suppression of authentic human responses. The concubines who won these competitions often suffered the most profound psychological damage because their success required the most complete betrayal of their own humanity. The training for these competitions began months in advance and involved not just practicing the physical movements, but conditioning emotional responses. Concubines would be subjected to various stresses and trained to maintain perfect composure regardless of what they were feeling internally. They learned to smile while in pain, to appear grateful while experiencing despair, to project serenity while drowning in anxiety. The judging criteria for these competitions were deliberately vague and subjective, making it impossible for concubines to understand exactly what was expected of them. This uncertainty was intentional because it prevented them from developing strategies for success that might allow them to maintain some sense of agency or control. The prizes for winning these competitions were carefully chosen to reinforce dependency rather than provide genuine rewards. Winners might receive slightly better food, marginally more comfortable quarters, or small luxuries that emphasized their continued captivity rather than offering any real improvement in their circumstances. But the most insidious prize was increased access to the emperor, presented as an honor, but actually representing greater vulnerability to imperial whims and potentially more dangerous forms of psychological manipulation. The winners of tea ceremony competitions often found themselves subject to more intensive scrutiny and more unpredictable demands than those who remained in the background. The seasonal decorations during tea ceremonies served as constant reminders of the passage of time and the concubine's inability to participate in the natural cycles of life. Spring decorations celebrated new growth while they remained trapped in stasis. Summer ornaments emphasized vitality while they grew weaker. Autumn arrangements honored harvest while they could never reap what they had sown. Winter displays marked the passage of years that brought them nothing but decline. The cherry blossoms during spring ceremonies were particularly cruel because they symbolized the brief, intense beauty that the concubines embodied. Like the flowers, they were admired for their delicate perfection, celebrated for their fleeting prime, and ultimately discarded when their beauty faded. The metaphor was so obvious that some concubines couldn't bear to look at the blossoms, while others stared at them obsessively, seeing their own futures in the falling petals. The incense burned during ceremonies was chosen not just for its pleasant aroma, but for its psychological effects. Different scents were believed to influence mood and behavior, and the palace officials used this knowledge to enhance the emotional manipulation of the concubines. Some incenses promoted relaxation and compliance. Others increased alertness and anxiety, all carefully selected to support the goals of each particular ceremony. The concubines learned to recognize these scents and anticipate their effects, but this knowledge only made the manipulation more frustrating because they understood what was being done to them, but were powerless to resist. They would sit in beautiful rooms filled with carefully chosen fragrances, knowing that even their emotional responses were being chemically influenced. The lighting during ceremonies was equally calculated. Soft, warm light was used to create artificial intimacy and comfort. Harsh, bright illumination was employed when officials wanted the concubines to feel exposed and vulnerable. Flickering candlelight created an atmosphere of uncertainty and instability. Every photon was weaponized in service of psychological control. The temperature in the ceremony rooms was regulated to create subtle discomfort that would keep the concubines alert and slightly on edge without being obvious enough to justify complaint. Too warm would make them sleepy and inattentive. Too cool would allow them to use physical discomfort as an excuse for poor performance. The perfect temperature was just uncomfortable enough to prevent relaxation while remaining within the bounds of apparent consideration for their comfort. The timing of bathroom breaks during extended ceremonies was used as another form of control. Concubines had to request permission to leave, but the timing of these requests was monitored and analyzed for patterns that might indicate planning or coordination among the prisoners. Those who requested breaks too frequently were seen as potentially disruptive. Those who never requested breaks were suspected of superhuman self-control that might indicate dangerous discipline. The water temperature for washing hands and faces before ceremonies was another subtle form of manipulation. Slightly too warm water would make them flushed and uncomfortable. Slightly too cool would make them appear pale and listless. The perfect temperature was calculated to maintain their appearance at optimal levels while providing no actual comfort or pleasure. Even the soap provided for these ablutions was chosen for its psychological effects. Harsh soaps would damage their skin and reduce their value. Luxurious soaps would provide too much sensory pleasure. The ideal soap was effective enough to maintain cleanliness, but provided no enjoyment, reinforcing the idea that even basic hygiene was a privilege granted by imperial generosity rather than a basic human right. The mirrors in the washing areas were positioned and angled to show the concubines from their least flattering perspectives, creating anxiety about their appearance that would carry over into their performance during ceremonies. They would see themselves as the officials wanted them to see themselves, as flawed objects in need of constant improvement, rather than as human beings deserving of basic dignity. The towels provided for drying were just slightly too small, requiring awkward contortions to use effectively. This seemingly minor inconvenience was actually a calculated reminder of their dependency on imperial provision for even the most basic necessities. They couldn't even dry themselves without being reminded that everything they used belonged to someone else. The clothing provided for ceremonies was tailored to be almost, but not quite comfortable. Sleeves that were slightly too tight, collars that chafed just barely, hems that caught on furniture if the wearer wasn't careful. These minor discomforts kept the concubines focused on their physical sensations rather than allowing them to lose themselves in thoughts or fantasies. The shoes were perhaps the most psychologically damaging element of ceremonial dress, because they were designed to alter the wearer's gait and posture in ways that reinforced submissiveness. Slightly elevated heels forced a shorter stride and more careful movement. Narrow toe boxes created discomfort that had to be endured without complaint. Soft soles provided no protection against uneven surfaces, making every step an exercise in vulnerability. The hair ornaments used during ceremonies were weighted and positioned to create subtle neck strain that would worsen throughout the event. The concubines had to maintain perfect posture despite increasing discomfort, learning to ignore their body's signals in favor of external expectations. This physical suppression paralleled and reinforced the emotional suppression required for psychological survival. The jewelry provided was crafted to be beautiful but uncomfortable, with chains that pulled slightly at the skin, bracelets that were just tight enough to restrict circulation, rings that clicked against teacups in ways that could be interpreted as nervous habits requiring correction. Every ornament was a small reminder of constraint disguised as adornment. The makeup applied before ceremonies was designed to look natural, but required constant maintenance to avoid smearing or fading. The concubines had to remain perfectly still and composed, not just for psychological reasons, but to avoid ruining their carefully applied faces. This created an additional layer of anxiety about their appearance that made genuine relaxation impossible. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of the tea ceremonies was the way they created artificial memories. The concubines would spend so much time performing happiness, gratitude, and contentment that some of them began to remember these performances as genuine experiences. Their minds, desperate for any positive associations with their circumstances, would trick them into believing they had actually enjoyed moments that had been pure torture. These false memories became another form of prison because they made it harder for concubines to maintain clarity about their situation. When your own mind betrays you by rewriting your experiences to make them seem more tolerable, it becomes almost impossible to hold on to the anger and resentment that might fuel resistance or escape attempts. The officials understood this psychological phenomenon and deliberately designed ceremonies to create maximum confusion between performance and reality. The line between acting grateful and feeling grateful became so blurred that many concubines lost the ability to distinguish between their authentic emotions and their required responses. This confusion extended beyond the ceremonies themselves and began to color every aspect of their existence. Concubines would find themselves unsure whether their friendships with each other were real or simply strategic alliances formed for survival. They would question whether their moments of happiness were genuine or just successful conditioning. They would doubt their own memories of life before the palace, wondering if their longing for freedom was authentic or just another form of performance. The tea ceremonies represented everything that was most insidious about the concubine system because they took the human capacity for social connection, cultural appreciation, and aesthetic pleasure and weaponized these natural impulses against their victims. They proved that even the most refined and civilized activities could be turned into instruments of oppression when they were imposed rather than chosen. And in the end, the ceremonies achieved their goal. They created men who were so thoroughly conditioned to perform happiness that they sometimes forgot what genuine happiness felt like. They produced human beings who were so skilled at suppressing their authentic responses that they lost access to their own emotional truth. They manufactured people who were beautiful, cultured, and utterly broken. The tea ceremonies continued day after day, year after year, century after century, a perfect machine for converting human beings into ornamental objects. The cups were always cold, the performances were always perfect, and the men who participated learned to mistake their prison for a palace, their torture for privilege, their destruction for refinement. But even as these ceremonies succeeded in breaking most of the concubines who endured them, they also created something unintended. A few men who learned to see through the illusion, who understood exactly how they were being manipulated, and who found ways to resist that were so subtle they were almost invisible. These rare individuals discovered that the deepest form of rebellion wasn't dramatic defiance, but rather the quiet maintenance of inner truth, despite overwhelming pressure to abandon it. They learned to perform perfectly while keeping a small, secret part of themselves untouched by the performance. They mastered the art of appearing grateful while remembering what they had lost. They became experts at projecting contentment while nurturing a carefully hidden flame of authentic feeling that no ceremony, no matter how perfectly designed, could extinguish. These men paid a terrible price for their clarity because they experienced the full horror of their situation without the mercy of delusion. But they also achieved something that their captors never intended and could never fully control. They remained human. And in remaining human, they proved that even the most sophisticated system of oppression could not completely destroy the human spirit, only hide it beneath layers of performance and pain. The tea ceremonies were meant to be the final step in the transformation of boys into ornamental objects. But for a few, they became instead a daily reminder of what they refused to become. Every sip of cold tea, every perfect bow, every required smile became an act of secret defiance, a quiet assertion that somewhere beneath the performance, the real person still existed, still remembered, and still hoped for something better than beautiful captivity. And the worst part about those tea ceremonies? They were just the warm-up act for what came next. Because once the sun set and the palace lanterns were lit, the real performance began. The evening entertainments where concubines weren't just required to look beautiful or speak eloquently. They had to become living fantasies, breathing embodiments of whatever desire happened to flicker through the imperial mind that night. The preparation for these evening sessions made the tea ceremony rituals look like child's play. Starting at sunset, teams of servants would descend on the concubine quarters like a plague of perfectionist locusts. Every surface of their bodies was scrutinized under lamplight that was deliberately harsh, designed to reveal every flaw that needed correction before the emperor's eyes could find it. The bathing process alone took 3 hours. Not because they were dirty, but because cleanliness wasn't the goal. Transformation was. They were scrubbed with brushes made from boar bristles until their skin glowed pink. and came the oils, different blends for different parts of their bodies. Jasmine for their necks to catch the emperor's attention when he leaned close. Sandalwood for their hands to leave a lingering scent on whatever they touched. Rose oil for their hair to create a subtle fragrance when they moved. But here's what made it truly horrifying. The oils weren't just for scent. They were mixed with substances that would make their skin more sensitive to touch, heightening their physical responses, whether they wanted those responses or not. Their bodies were being chemically prepared to betray them, to react in ways that would please their captors regardless of their actual feelings. The clothing selection was a psychological torture session disguised as fashion consultation. Eunuch attendants would hold up different fabrics against their skin, debating colors like they were decorating a room rather than dressing a human being. Silk that was too bold might overshadow their features. Fabric that was too subdued might make them forgettable. The perfect shade had to complement their complexion while matching the emperor's mood, which changed as unpredictably as the weather. And the textures. Sweet mercy. The textures. Silk so smooth it felt like water against their skin. Cotton so soft it seemed to melt under their fingers. Fabrics that were pleasant to the touch weren't chosen for the concubine's comfort. They were selected because they would be pleasant for someone else to touch, to remove, to discard carelessly on silk carpets when their purpose had been served. The jewelry was applied like armor, layer upon layer of gold and jade that clinked softly with every movement. But this wasn't protection. It was advertisement. Each piece was chosen to catch candlelight, to draw attention to specific parts of their bodies, to create visual interest that would hold imperial attention long enough for other forms of entertainment to begin. The makeup application was an art form that would have impressed Renaissance masters if it hadn't been so fundamentally degrading. Foundation that made their skin appear porcelain perfect. Rouge that created the illusion of natural blushes in response to compliments they hadn't received. Eye paint that made their gazes appear larger, more innocent, more vulnerable. But the most insidious part was the lip preparation. A special paste was applied that made their lips appear naturally flushed and slightly swollen, as if they'd been recently kissed. The paste also contained mild numbing agents that would prevent them from grimacing if they had to do things they found repulsive. Their own facial expressions were being chemically regulated to ensure they couldn't accidentally reveal their true feelings. The hairstyling was its own form of architectural torture. Elaborate constructions that took hours to build and had to remain perfect throughout the evening regardless of what activities might disturb them. The weight of the ornaments alone was enough to cause neck pain, but complaining about discomfort wasn't an option. They had to appear graceful and comfortable, even when their scalps ached from the tension of pins and their necks cramped from supporting decorative sculptures. The posture training was relentless and specific to each evening's expected activities. If the emperor was in a contemplative mood, they practiced sitting in positions that would showcase their profile while appearing thoughtfully engaged. If he preferred active entertainment, they rehearsed movements that would display their flexibility and grace. If he wanted intimate conversation, they learned to lean and gesture in ways that would seem naturally seductive while maintaining apparent innocence. But here's what made the evening preparations truly psychologically devastating. The concubines had to participate in planning their own objectification. They were asked for their opinions about which colors looked best on them, which hairstyles they preferred, which jewelry they thought was most flattering. The system forced them to become collaborators in their own degradation, making them complicit in turning themselves into objects for someone else's pleasure. The mirrors in the preparation chambers were positioned to show them from every angle simultaneously, creating a disorienting kaleidoscope of their own reflection. They could see themselves being transformed in real time, watching their humanity disappear beneath layers of cosmetics and costume. Some learned to avoid looking at the mirrors entirely, but the attendants would force them to observe their own transformation, to approve each step of the process that was erasing their authentic selves. The fragrance application was the final step, and it was applied with the precision of a military operation. Different scents for different parts of their bodies, creating layers of aroma that would unfold gradually as the evening progressed. Light, floral notes at their wrists and temples that would be noticed immediately. Deeper, more complex fragrances at their throat and behind their ears that would only be detected during close contact. And subtle, almost subliminal scents applied to their clothing that would linger in rooms long after they had left. The psychological preparation was even more intensive than the physical transformation. While their bodies were being perfected, their minds were being programmed with detailed scenarios for the evening ahead. They were briefed on the emperor's current interests, his recent moods, his preferred topics of conversation. They memorized appropriate responses to dozens of potential situations, rehearsing reactions that would seem spontaneous while being entirely calculated. They practiced different types of laughter for different types of imperial jokes. Gentle chuckles for subtle wit, musical peals for clever wordplay, appreciative giggles for humor they didn't understand but were expected to find charming. They learned to modulate their voices to match whatever emotion the emperor might want to hear, speaking more softly when he seemed tired, more enthusiastically when he appeared energetic, more pensively when he was in a philosophical mood. The education in imperial preferences extended to the most intimate details. They learned which foods the emperor enjoyed feeding to others, which wines he preferred to share, which games he liked to play with his companions. They memorized the rules of dozens of diversions they would never choose for themselves, but might be required to enjoy with convincing enthusiasm. But perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of the evening preparation was the way it created artificial anticipation. The concubines were encouraged to express excitement about the upcoming entertainment, to appear eager for the emperor's attention, to project gratitude for the opportunity to serve. They had to generate enthusiasm for experiences they dreaded while suppressing any sign of their actual emotions. Some concubines developed elaborate internal fantasy worlds to cope with this psychological pressure. While their bodies were being prepared for imperial pleasure, their minds would escape into imagined scenarios where they were the protagonists of their own stories rather than supporting characters in someone else's entertainment. These mental refuges were dangerous because being caught daydreaming during preparation could result in punishment, but they were sometimes the only way to maintain psychological survival. Others learned to dissociate so completely that they could watch their own preparation as if it were happening to someone else. They would observe the transformation of their bodies with clinical detachment, noting the application of cosmetics and the arrangement of clothing as if they were studying a painting rather than experiencing personal violation. This detachment was protective, but came at the cost of losing connection to their own physical sensations and emotional responses. The timing of the preparation was calculated to maximize psychological pressure. It began early enough that the concubines had hours to contemplate what was coming, building anxiety and dread. But it also moved at a pace that prevented them from processing their emotions or developing coping strategies. They were kept busy with constant adjustments to their appearance while their minds raced with anticipation and fear. The other concubines who weren't selected for evening entertainment were required to assist with the preparation, creating a complex dynamic of relief, jealousy, and sympathetic suffering. Those helping with the transformation were grateful not to be the focus of attention, while simultaneously feeling guilty about their relief. Those being prepared experienced the additional humiliation of being groomed by their peers, men who understood exactly what they were going through, but were powerless to help or intervene. The competitive atmosphere during preparation was toxic and deliberate. Multiple concubines might be prepared simultaneously, with the understanding that only some would actually be chosen for the evening's entertainment. This created a desperate scramble for perfection, with each man trying to outshine his companions while appearing to maintain friendly relationships with them. The selection process was announced at the last possible moment, after all the preparation had been completed. This meant that several concubines might spend hours being transformed into perfect ornamental objects, only to be dismissed and sent back to their quarters, while others were chosen for imperial attention. The rejected men had to hide their relief while appearing disappointed, maintaining the fiction that being selected was an honor rather than an ordeal. Those who were chosen had to transition immediately from preparation mode to performance mode, switching from the anxiety of anticipation to the terror of actual interaction. There was no time to process the selection, no moment to prepare mentally for what was about to happen. They went directly from being groomed like prize livestock to being expected to embody sophistication, charm, and enthusiasm. To walk from the preparation chambers to the imperial quarters was its own form of psychological torture. The concubines moved through palace corridors they had traversed hundreds of times before, but now every step brought them closer to experiences they couldn't predict or control. The familiar architecture seemed threatening, the beautiful decorations appeared ominous, and the servants they passed averted their eyes as if witnessing something shameful. The guards who escorted them to these evening entertainments were specially chosen for their intimidating presence and their complete silence. They communicated only through gestures, creating an atmosphere of ceremonial solemnity that made the concubines feel like they were being led to execution rather than entertainment. The sound of their own footsteps on marble floors became deafening in the silence, each click of their shoes marking another step toward experiences they couldn't escape. The final moments before entering the imperial presence were filled with last-minute adjustments that felt more like final rites than preparation. Attendants would make tiny corrections to their appearance, adjusting a fold of fabric here, repositioning a jewel there, as if these microscopic improvements could somehow protect them from whatever was about to happen. And then the doors would open, candlelight would spill across their carefully prepared faces, and the performance would begin. But by now, after hours of physical and psychological preparation, the men who entered those chambers were no longer entirely themselves. They had been transformed into living art objects, breathing fantasies, human dolls programmed to respond in whatever ways would provide the most satisfaction to their imperial audience. The evening entertainments themselves varied wildly, depending on the emperor's whims, but they all shared certain characteristics that made them psychological endurance tests, disguised as cultural refinement. Sometimes they involved elaborate dinner parties, where concubines were expected to be charming dinner companions, engaging in witty conversation while being fed delicacies by imperial hands. Other evenings focused on artistic performances, with concubines singing, dancing, or reciting poetry while being watched with the intense focus of a predator studying prey. But the most psychologically challenging entertainments were the intimate gatherings where concubines were expected to be confidants and companions, listening to imperial concerns, offering comfort and advice, providing emotional support to the same system that was destroying them. These sessions required them to project genuine care and concern for their captors, well-being while suppressing their own desperate need for compassion and understanding. The emperors themselves were often as trapped by these rituals as the concubines, though their prison was made of power rather than powerlessness. They had been raised to see other human beings as objects for their pleasure, entertainment, and comfort. They had never learned to form genuine relationships based on mutual respect and affection. So even when they craved authentic connection, they were incapable of creating the conditions that would allow it to flourish. This created a bizarre dynamic where both the emperor and the concubines were performing roles that prevented real intimacy. while desperately seeking the human connection that their circumstances made impossible. The emperor would demand authenticity from men who had been systematically trained to be inauthentic, creating frustration and disappointment that would often be blamed on the concubines rather than the system that created the problem. The aftermath of these evening entertainments was perhaps even more psychologically damaging than the events themselves. Concubines would return to their quarters in the early hours of the morning, their carefully applied makeup smeared, their elaborate hairstyles disheveled, their expensive clothing wrinkled and stained. They had to remove all traces of the evening's activities while processing whatever had happened to them without any support or counseling. The other concubines who had not been selected would watch their companions return, reading their faces and body language for clues about what to expect if they were chosen next time. These observers learned to recognize the signs of particular types of entertainment, developing an informal intelligence network that helped them prepare mentally for their own eventual selection. The cleaning process after these evenings was methodical and symbolic. Every trace of imperial contact had to be removed through elaborate bathing rituals that were supposed to purify the concubines for future use. But this purification process only reinforced their status as objects that could be soiled and needed to be cleaned, rather than human beings who had endured traumatic experiences. The reporting requirements after evening entertainments were perhaps the cruelest aspect of the entire system. Concubines were expected to provide detailed accounts of the emperor's mood, preferences, and reactions, essentially being forced to evaluate their own performance as entertainment objects. They had to analyze their success at providing pleasure while suppressing any acknowledgement of their own suffering. These reports were used to refine future preparation and training, creating a feedback loop that made the system increasingly efficient at producing exactly the types of experiences the emperor preferred. The concubines' own observations were used against them, helping their captors become more skilled at psychological and physical manipulation. The competitive ranking that resulted from these performance evaluations created additional psychological pressure as concubines were compared against each other based on their success at being objectified. Those who received high marks for their entertainment value were rewarded with better treatment, but also faced increased pressure to maintain their performance levels. Those who received poor evaluations faced punishment and the constant threat of disposal. The seasonal variations in evening entertainments followed the same patterns as other palace activities, but with additional layers of psychological complexity. Spring entertainments emphasized youthful vitality and new beginnings, forcing aging concubines to perform energetic enthusiasm while confronting their own declining value. Summer sessions focused on passion and intensity, requiring emotional performances that drained psychological resources. Autumn entertainments centered on sophistication and maturity, demanding wisdom and depth from men who had been systematically prevented from developing authentic life experiences. Winter evening entertainments were the most psychologically challenging because they emphasized intimacy and comfort during the season, when depression and despair were most likely to overwhelm the concubines' psychological defenses. They were required to provide warmth and companionship while experiencing their own deepest cold, to offer comfort while receiving none themselves. The holiday entertainments throughout the year created additional psychological burdens as concubines were forced to celebrate festivals that emphasized family, freedom, and joy while being permanently separated from their own families and denied any genuine autonomy or happiness. They had to embody the spirit of celebrations they could never truly participate in, becoming living symbols of concepts they had been denied. The New Year entertainments were particularly cruel because they required concubines to project hope and optimism about the future, while knowing that their own futures held nothing but continued captivity and eventual disposal. They had to toast to new beginnings while trapped in eternal repetition, celebrate renewal while experiencing only decay. The birthday celebrations for the emperor created their own unique psychological challenges as concubines, were expected to express genuine joy and gratitude for the continued life of the person who held them captive. They had to sing songs of celebration while their own lives remained frozen in time, offer gifts while possessing nothing that truly belonged to them, express wishes for imperial health and longevity while their own well-being was considered irrelevant. The funeral entertainments held when imperial family members or high officials died required concubines to provide comfort and distraction during periods of official mourning, forcing them to suppress any grief they might feel for their own losses, while focusing entirely on comforting others. These sessions were particularly psychologically complex because they required authentic emotional responses to deaths that often represented relief or hope for change, while maintaining perfect composure and supportive behavior. The most sophisticated psychological manipulation occurred during the rare entertainments where concubines were allowed to express their own preferences or make choices about activities. These apparent grants of autonomy were carefully staged to create the illusion of freedom while actually reinforcing their captivity. Being asked to choose between predetermined options created a false sense of agency that made their lack of real choice more psychologically tolerable. These mock choices were used to gather information about the concubines' personalities and preferences, data that would later be used to refine their training and make their psychological manipulation more effective. Their own expressed desires became tools for their oppression, their authentic preferences used to create more convincing performances of satisfaction with their circumstances. The evening entertainments continued night after night, year after year, creating a rhythm of anticipation, performance, and recovery that became the defining pattern of concubine existence. Each cycle wore away a little more of their authentic selves, while building up layers of performance skill and psychological armor that helped them survive, but prevented them from truly living. The men who endured these entertainments learned to measure time not in days or weeks, but in performances, marking their lives by the number of times they had successfully transformed themselves into whatever fantasy was required. Their identities became collections of learned responses rather than authentic personalities, their memories filled with performed experiences rather than genuine ones. And yet, despite everything, despite the systematic destruction of their humanity and the relentless pressure to become perfect ornamental objects, some spark of authentic self remained hidden deep within a few of these men. It was buried beneath layers of performance and pain, protected by psychological defenses that had been built through years of careful mental discipline, but it survived. These rare individuals learned to maintain their inner truth while perfecting their outer performance, becoming masters of a form of resistance so subtle it was invisible to their captors. They found ways to remain human while appearing to be perfectly programmed objects, holding on to memories of who they had been while becoming whatever they needed to be to survive. Their resistance wasn't dramatic or obvious. It consisted of tiny moments of authentic feeling quickly hidden, brief flashes of genuine emotion immediately suppressed, small acts of mental rebellion that left no external trace. But these moments accumulated over time, creating an internal foundation of selfhood that no amount of training or manipulation could completely destroy. The evening entertainments were designed to be the final step in the complete transformation of human beings into living toys, breathing fantasies that existed solely for imperial pleasure. For most concubines, they succeeded in this goal, creating men who were so thoroughly broken and rebuilt that they forgot what it felt like to be genuinely human. But for a few, these nightly ordeals became instead a proving ground where their humanity was tested, refined, and ultimately preserved through sheer force of will and careful psychological strategy. They learned that the deepest form of resistance wasn't refusing to perform, but rather maintaining awareness of the performance while executing it perfectly. These men paid a terrible price for their clarity, experiencing the full horror of their situation without the mercy of psychological numbness or self-deception. But they also achieved something their captors never intended and could never fully control. They remained authentically themselves beneath their performed selves, keeping alive the possibility that someday, somehow, they might reclaim the lives that had been stolen from them. The evening entertainments were meant to be the crown jewel of the concubine system, the ultimate demonstration of imperial power over human will and dignity. But in the end, they also became proof that even the most sophisticated oppression could not completely extinguish the human spirit, only force it underground where it waited, patient and unbroken, for its moment to resurface.